Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. This video briefly introduces the developments of Han Chinese scholarly literature and arts during the period of division after the fall of Han Dynasty, and then the writing and the life of a woman writer from the period, Xie Daoyun. First, to review, in the last video we have talked about the historical transitions from the Three Kingdoms to the Jin Dynasty, and then to the northern and southern dynasties after the fall of Han. During this period of division, the continuation and developments of Han Chinese scholarly literature and arts occurred mostly through the Wei Dynasty, the Jin Dynasty, including the Western Jin and Eastern Jin, and the four southern dynasties, Song, Qi, Liang, Chen. In the last video, we've mentioned that unstable dynastic politics resulted in the general sense of the loss of center and the growing influences of Buddhism and Taoism in both the north and south. For Han Chinese scholarly officials, Taoism's influences manifested as the practice of pure talk, qingtan, in which they debated each other for hours on mystical and abstract Taoist concepts, completely detached from reality, while dressing in long robes and using Taoist whisks called fuchen. The same mentality also cultivated an art for art's sake movement among Han Chinese scholar officials. Literature and arts thus started to move away from their previous political moral functions and came to be valued primarily on aesthetic grounds. Literary and artistic works were also taken as manifestations of one's distinctive personality and an authentic individual spirit, often at odds with social norms. In our last video, we have mentioned that after the loss of Northern Territory to non-Han forces, artistic trends in the South was also related to a rising nationalist sentiment about Han Chinese cultural identity. Han Chinese culture in the South became even more refined and introspective, in part to draw a sharper distinction from the more martial image of northern nomadic ethnicities. Furthermore, we should mention that the Han Chinese political system during the period of division was in fact largely aristocratic, that is to say, heavily dependent on family lineages. This was because even though Confucianism remained a dominant ruling philosophy for the Han Chinese dynasties, the civil examination system was not systematically adopted during this period. Rather, official recruitment occurred through a system of recommendation that ultimately favored those having family or strong social connections to those already in positions of power. By the time of the Jin Dynasty, a number of prestigious lineages monopolized court positions and became extremely wealthy. These lineages also enjoyed the best resources for literary and artistic education, so famous poets and artists of the period were often of aristocratic family backgrounds. With these contexts in mind, let's look at a group of poets and artists who embodied the eccentric individualism, as well as Taoist mysticism and artistic talents, which came to be prized in the scholarly culture during the period of division. This group of poets and artists is collectively known as the Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove, 竹林七贤, since they reportedly had frequent gatherings in the bamboo grove, which symbolizes the purity and transcendence of nature. The Seven Sages lived during the final years of the Wei Dynasty, during the 3rd century. However, the book that made them famous came from about more than a century later, during the Southern Dynasty, Song. That is a book of anecdotes titled 世说新语, a new account of tales of the world. We'll call it Tales for short. The author of Tales was Liu Yiqing, who lived during the first half of the 5th century. The anecdotes collected in Tales are mostly about scholarly figures from the Wei and the Jin dynasties. The accounts about Xie Daoyun, the woman writer we'll talk about soon, come from this book as well. In general, the anecdotes in Tales highlight the most interesting and representative moments, which are indicative of an individual's inner personality. The narratives in the book are quite vivid, although it's difficult to tell how authentic they are, especially regarding stories about earlier figures such as the 7 sages. Considering the historical context of the Southern dynasties, the images of the sages could have been reinvented by Liu Yiqing or the generations before him to present Han Chinese scholarly ideals on the rise after the loss of the Northern territories. Notably, these ideals are characterized by a rejection of or an argument against ritual restrictions. As we'll see, stories about the 7 sages celebrate their impulsive and sometimes outrageous behaviors. On a philosophical level, these stories suggest that moral integrity and purity rests with individual nature rather than any external rules or authorities. Whereas this individualistic tendency can be related to Taoism, according to which society and civilization could be corrupt, it also has roots in the Confucian theory that human nature is essentially good, and therefore everyone is capable of cultivation. Furthermore, Confucian writings since the Analects, that is the collection of Confucius sayings, often state that political and social power could become corrupt, and a cultivated person should act according to what's right instead of what's convenient. Thus, even though the defiant behaviors embodied by the 7 sages may look anti-Confucian, they do correspond to the individualist spirit within Confucianism. Now, let's look at some stories about these sages to see how unconventional they could get. The first story is about Ranji, a leading figure of the sages. As the story goes, the wife of Ranji's neighbor was very pretty. She worked as a barmaid, tending the vats and selling wine. Ran and Wang Rong frequently drank at her place, and after Ran became drunk, he would sleep by this woman's side. Her husband at first was extraordinarily suspicious of him, but after careful investigation, he eventually ceased to think anything amiss. This story may sound shocking even by today's standards. However, by showing that there was nothing amiss, even when Ranji slept next to another man's wife after he was drunk, the story indicates that his impulsive and offensive behavior did not overstep any fundamental moral boundary. Thus, even when he violated ritual codes, he was not necessarily a bad person. From the perspective of women's studies, however, we may further observe that this story about Ranji's unconventional behavior was given from a male-centered perspective. The woman in the story almost serves a kind of a prop, and none of her side of the story is shown to the reader. This story also indicates the sage's fondness for wine, or rather alcohol. In the scholarly tradition, especially starting from the period of division and onward, drinking became an artistic virtue of sort, celebrated for unleashing one's inner spirit and inspiring an individual to be more authentic and creative. A number of famous poets in Chinese history, such as the Tang poet Li Bai, were known for their fondness for drinking. We'll see the trope of drinking in women's poetic writings as well. Some stories in tales nevertheless provide sobering reminders that the sages' apparently carefree behaviors occurred during a period of perilous political struggles. Ji Kang, another leading figure of the seven sages, was slandered and executed at the age of 40 due to his slighting of a powerful minister. The story that took place on the execution ground became very famous in the Chinese tradition. On the eve of Ji Kang's execution in the eastern marketplace of Luoyang, his spirit and manner showed no change. Taking out his 7-stringed zither, he plucked the strings and played the melody of Guangling. When the song was ended, he said, Yuan Xiaoni once asked to learn this melody, but I remained firm in my stubbornness and never gave it to him. From now on, the melody of Guangling is no more. 3,000 scholars of the Grand Academy sent up a petition requesting Ji's release to become their teacher, but it was not granted. Sima Zhao himself later repented of it. This story demonstrates Ji Kang's transcendent mindset when facing death, as his worries were not so much about the discontinuation of his life, but the discontinuation of his music. On a general level, the memorable scene of Ji Kang's execution exemplifies what's being valued about the seven sages in the scholarly tradition, that is, their non-conformative behavior and dedication to the arts bespeak both an attitude of political defiance and a yearning towards a higher domain of meaning. In this manner, the sages' images integrate both the Confucian virtue of integrity and the Taoist philosophy of spiritual freedom. Upon the models of the seven sages, scholars of the Jin dynasty and the later southern dynasties continue to prize unconventional personalities and to place an existential value on artistic pursuits. The scholarly arts that matured in this process and gained more aesthetic and individualistic characteristics include calligraphy, painting, and poetry. The most famous calligrapher from the period, who was also regarded as the greatest calligrapher of all time in the Chinese tradition, is Wang Xizhi from the Eastern Jin dynasty. He has been known as the calligraphy sage, Shu Sheng, an epithet indicating that he is the ultimate master of the art of calligraphy. Let's keep this name in mind, since the woman writer we'll talk about, Xie Daoyun, was his daughter-in-law. She married Wang Xizhi's second son, Wang Ningzhi. Now, you may assume that being married into such an illustrious literary family must befit a talented woman writer. Yet, even though Xie Daoyun's husband, Wang Ningzhi, was an excellent calligrapher himself, we do know that Xie Daoyun pretty much despised him, and perhaps for good reasons. Xie Daoyun herself was also a celebrity of sort during her lifetime, and even up to today, she's been known for a single line of poem she wrote when she was quite young, a line that has become a standard phrase to refer to a talented girl. First, let's take a look at Xie Daoyun's family background, which was very prestigious. The Wang family she married into was one of the most powerful aristocratic households of the time, and was also renowned for its literary talents, as in the case of the great calligrapher Wang Xizhi. The Xie family, where Xie Daoyun came from, was likewise powerful and famed for literary and artistic cultivation. In fact, Xie Daoyun's uncle was no other than Xie An, the prime minister of the dynasty. Regarding Xie An, there's a famous story about him calmly finishing a game of Go with a guest, even after he learned in the middle of the game about the Eastern Jin army's victory in a critical battle against the Northern Kingdom Qin near the River Huai, the border between the North and South. When being inquired what happened, he simply stated that the kids won the battle. However, later, perhaps due to his secret excitement, he forgot to step over the threshold to his bedroom and broke his wooden sandal without realizing it. This anecdote is collected in Tales, 世说新语, and provides another example for the kind of cool personality being prized during the Jin dynasty and afterwards. The episode that made Xie Daoyun famous is likewise collected in Tales. Now let's read the story together. One cold snowy day, the grand guardian Xie An gathered all of his relatives together and was discussing the principles of literature with the young men and the women when suddenly a heavy snow began to fall. Overjoyed, he said, "To what can it be compared, this fluttering white snow?" Hu Er, a son of his elder brother, said, "To salt being scattered in the sky it may be compared. 撒盐空中差可拟." But the daughter of his elder brother, that is Xie Daoyun, exclaimed, "Oh no, to willow floss drifting in the wind. 未若柳絮因风起." Xie An laughed heartily. She was the daughter of his eldest brother, Wu Yi, the later wife of general on the left, Wang Xizhi. Xie An's hearty laughter indicated his approval of Xie Daoyun's metaphor. What's worth noting is that in the original, Xie Daoyun's answer using the image of the willow floss, 未若柳絮因风起, formed a perfect line of poetry that corresponds to and rhymes with the first line using the image of salt the brother had come up with, 撒盐空中差可拟. So, in addition to demonstrating her poetic imagination, the answer illustrated her fine literary skills as well. And here are images of the willow floss for your imagination. Do they look like the perfect metaphor for floating snow? For the later generations, this willow floss episode became legendary for its presentation of the image of Xie Daoyun as a girl prodigy. In traditional Chinese writings, the talent to sing of the willow floss, 永续之才, serves as a reference to a talented woman, especially a talented young woman. That is, as the Chinese term goes, 才女. The talent celebrated in the cases of 才女 was almost always about poetic talent, and the image of this type of young woman suggests a precocious and unusual literary gift, which seems to be born with nature or coming down from heaven against all social expectations. Later, Xie Daoyun's marriage to Wang Xizhi, a son of the greatest calligrapher of all time and from another powerful aristocratic household, may look like a fairy tale. Yet surprisingly enough, she openly despised her husband, as we can see in this record in her official biography from the history of Jin. After the wife of Wang Xizhi, Lady Xie, married him, she came to despise him greatly. When she returned home on a visit to the Xie family, she expressed to them her great displeasure. The great guardian Xie An tried to comfort her, saying, "Not only is young Wang the son of Wang Xizhi, he himself doesn't have such a bad personality. Why must you persist in sulking?" She answered him, "Here, in just a single household, I have men like you and the general for uncles, and Feng, Hu, He, and Mo for brothers and cousins, I would never have imagined that between heaven and earth could exist such a thing as young Wang. So, according to this answer, her husband's intelligence and personality paled in comparison to those young men in her own family, brothers and cousins, who were far smarter and a lot more interesting. Here we may see that Xie Daoyun had a relatively close relationship with her male peers in the family and knew them pretty well. This indicates that the rule of gender segregation was not very strictly implicated in the Xie household, especially for younger girls. Yet, what's even more notable is that by the last line of her comment, Xie Daoyun was basically saying that her husband's foolishness was beyond imagination. She could hardly believe that a man as tall as him could have existed in this world. This comment is likely the most openly defiant comments from a wife on her husband in official historical records from traditional China. Another episode in Xie Daoyun's biography reveals that her intelligence outshone other sons of the Wang family as well, as shown in this story. Once, Ningzhi's younger brother Xianzhi was engaged in a philosophical discussion with some guests. Just as he was about to concede defeat, Daoyun sent a servant girl to tell him, "Let him lift the siege for my little brother-in-law." Then, shielding herself from their gaze behind a movable screen of green silk, she defended Xianzhi's earlier argument so skillfully that the guests were unable to defeat her. Here we see that Xie Daoyun was shielded by a screen, following the ritual prescription on gender segregation for a married woman. Yet the screen did not prevent her superior intelligence and her eloquent words from shining out. And according to a story in Tales, 世说新语, even though Xie Daoyun believed that her brothers were a lot smarter than her husband, she might openly scorn them as well if they fell below her expectations. As reported in this story, the wife of the prefect of Jiangzhou, that is Xie Daoyun, once said to Xie He, her younger brother, "Why is it you're no longer making any progress? Is it because your mind is so taken up by common affairs? Or is it that the gifts that heaven has bestowed on you are so limited?" Based on this story, one could only imagine how strict Xie Daoyun would have been if she were a professor today. Xie Daoyun's strong character might be part of her inherent personality, but it was also related to the valorization of unconventional individuality during the period. Moreover, it's possible she was influenced by the example of other strong women in her household, especially the wife of her uncle Xie An, Lady Liu. We have introduced Xie An as the prime minister of the time and was well known for his coolness and cultivation. However, Lady Liu seemed to have a way with her powerful husband so that he could control his impulses and respect her feelings. In particular, we can witness Lady Liu's character in this story included in Tales 世说新语. Lady Liu, the wife of His Excellency Xie, did not allow her husband to keep any concubines, but His Excellency was a great lover of women, and finding it impossible to control his desires, wanted to purchase a large number of concubines and performers. His cousins, who knew only too well of his intentions, tried to persuade Lady Liu to be somewhat more accommodating. They said to her, "The ospreys and locusts," ancient poems from the Confucian classic odes, praise the virtue of not being jealous. Here, to supply a relevant context, the Confucian classic Odes, evoked by the male cousins of the Xie family, is the book of poetry, Shi Jing, we have mentioned earlier in the story of concubine Ban. Other than including poems written in the voice of slandered palace ladies, the collection also includes some poems that was interpreted as illustrating the virtue of a consort, that is, the virtue of not being jealous and aiding her husband to select other concubines for the inner palace. The book of poetry was supposedly compiled by Confucius, and the authorship of many poems was traditionally attributed to the Duke of Zhou, Zhou Gong, a legendary minister of the early Western Zhou dynasty. As we'll see next, the male identity of the poem's putative author became an evidence for Lady Liu's rebuttal. Now let's continue with the story. Lady Liu, aware of what they were up to, asked, "Who was the author of the odes?" They replied, "The Duke of Zhou." Lady Liu then said, "The Duke of Zhou was a man and wrote in defense of his own interests. If the odes had been written by his wife, words such as these would not be found in the canon." This last comment is as feminist as one could get in the context of traditional China. Growing up with the example of such an unconventional and intelligent aunt who was articulate of the male bias of the Confucian canon, no wonder Xie Daoyun developed the strong personality manifested in historical records. Other accounts in tales indicate that Xie Daoyun's strong and almost masculine personality was well known during the time and was well respected. We can see this assessment from the following story. Xie He elevated his elder sister above all other women. Zhang Xuan, who always praised his own younger sister, insisted that the two women were on a par with one another. Now there was a certain nun by the name of Ji, who frequented both the Zhang and the Xie households. When people asked her for a ranking, she replied, "The spirit and feelings of Lady Wang exude an encompassing radiance, and that is why her personality impresses one as resembling that of one of the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. The pure heart of Lady Gu shines like jade, so of course among women she is peerless." The brother who elevated Xie Daoyun above all women was the very brother she scolded for not making progress in his studies, as we have seen in an earlier story. As indicated by this story, he respected and valued his older sister very much. The nun's role is also interesting, reflecting the freedom of movement and social authority possessed by a religious woman during the time. In comparing Xie Daoyun to the 7 sages, the nun also underscored her comparability to a male scholar and her elevated spirit and talent beyond gender distinction. As to Xie Daoyun's own literary works, she left behind a few poems of a masculine flavor. That is, instead of focusing on romance and emotions, she portrays in her poem the grandeur of nature and its underlying Taoist and Confucian philosophies, such as in this poem on the topic of Mount Tai, a sacred mountain in both Confucian and Taoist traditions. Now let's read this poem together. How they tower, those lofty eastern mountains. They soar straight up and pierce the azure sky. Within these crags are hidden empty holes, their mystery deepened by a silent darkness. Not built either by craftsman or by artisan, the misty structures are produced by nature. 峨峨东岳高，秀极冲青天。岩中兼须臾，寂寞幽已悬。 非攻复非将，云构发自然。To slightly digress, the empty halls in the poem refer to the grottos in a mountain. According to the Taoist belief, these mysterious caves are where immortals dwell. As the poem concludes, Xie Daoyun wished to spend the rest of her years in those grottos like an immortal. What is it about these apparitions that propels me there again and again? Let me go and settle in those halls, and there live out my allotted years. 气象尔何物，遂令我屡迁。是将宅思语，可以尽天年。One fact to note is that Xie Daoyun couldn't have visited the actual Mount Tai. It's part of the northern territory occupied by non-Han dynasties. She must have imagined Mount Tai according to what she had learned in books and used the trope of the mountain to express her transcendent aspirations. Yet in some poems, Xie Daoyun also expresses a sarcastic attitude at Taoist mysticism, such as in this poem, written in response to an earlier poem by Ji Kang, the famous leading figure of the Seven Sages. This poem alludes to a myth about Wang Xizhi, who became an immortal and rode on a white crane in the setting of a pine tree grove, which symbolizes immortality and purity. As Xie Daoyun's poem goes, I look at that pine tree yonder on the hill. The coldest winter cannot make it wither. How I long to go there and rest beneath it, where I can gaze forever at its branches. I jump up, but find I cannot soar in flight. Stamping my feet, I wait for Wang Xizhi. But time, alas, has never been on my side, and I'm swept along by transformation. 遥望山上松，隆冬不能雕。愿想游下气，沾笔万仞条。腾跃未能升，顿足似王桥。实哉不我与，大运所飘摇。By portraying her failure to soar up like Wang Xizhi, Xie Daoyun's poem mixes sarcasm and a sense of sadness. Could we interpret it as a metaphor of the social restrictions being placed on her as a woman, or her unhappy marriage to a man unworthy of her talent? In Xie Daoyun's official biography, we can also find a life or death crisis that reveals why Xie Daoyun thought so poorly about her husband and the courage she is capable of upon that juncture. The Wangs had for generations been believers of the way of 5 pecks of rice founded by the Zhangs, and Ningzhi was an especially ardent believer. When Sun En, a rebel, attacked Guiji, his subordinate asked him to take precautions, but Ningzhi did not heed them. The Way of 5 Pecks of Rice is a Taoist religious cult that began to emerge during the Eastern Han, founded by Zhang Daolin, known as the Celestial Master Tian Shi. The cult received its name since all worshippers must donate 5 pecks of rice as an initiation ritual. The cult practiced incantation and made charms and amulets based on the Taoist classic Tao Te Ching, and had a deep belief in spirit forces. Xie Daoyun's husband Wang Ningzhi, as an ardent believer of the cult, took the idea of the spirit force too far and believed that it could help him fend off real rebels, as the account goes. As soon as he had entered his private room and prayed, he came out and told his officers, I have already prayed to the Great Way and have been promised spirit troops, which will be sent to our aid the rebels will naturally be defeated. Subsequently, since he had taken no precautions, Ningzhi was killed by Sun En. Wang Ningzhi paid with his life for his foolish belief, yet Xie Daoyun demonstrated incredible courage and calmness upon this critical moment, as her biography records. During the rebellion of Sun En, Xie Daoyun remained unperturbed, but when she heard that her husband and her sons had been killed by the bandits, she ordered her female servants to take her out in her sedan chair, and with drawn sword, she exited the gate. When the mutinous troops came near, she was captured, but only after having slain several of them with her own hand. With her courage and charisma, Xie Daoyun also protected her grandson from harm, as the account goes. At that time, her grandson Liu Tao was just a few years old. When the bandits wanted to kill him as well, Daoyun said, "What does your quarrel with the Wang family have to do with other clans? But if you insist on killing him, I would rather be killed first." Vicious and cruel as Sun En was, he fumed pale at these words, and in the end did not kill Liu Tao. Soon, the rebel force was quelled, and Xie Daoyun spent the rest of her life, 22 years, rather uneventfully as a widow. There's very little left about her life during this time, except for this snippet. Afterwards, she lived as a widow in Guiji, and the rules in her household were all extremely strict. The prefect Liu Liu had heard of her reputation and asked to be allowed to have a discussion with her. Daoyun was aware of Liu Liu's fame, and so did not refuse his request. With her hair pinned up in a bun, she sat on a white cushion inside the curtains of her couch. Liu, dressed in formal attire, took his seat on a separate couch. Daoyun's demeanor was extremely lofty, and her words were pure and elegant. At first, when they touched upon the affairs of her family, she was overcome by emotion and wept copiously. But when eventually she replied to his questions, her words and reasoning were eloquent. After Liu Liu had left the room, he said admiringly, "I have truly never before met such a person as this. You have only to observe her words and her presence to want to yield to her body and mind." Daoyun, for her part, said, "This is the first time since the death of my relatives that I've met such a gentleman. I found listening to his questions truly illuminating." This story illustrates Xie Daoyun's lonely and likely very bored state in her widowhood, and her incredible intellectual sharpness and charisma even as she aged. It's left to our imagination as to why she remained a widow. Perhaps she after all couldn't find a man worthy of her talent. Moreover, in the later cultural memory, Xie Daoyun's image got stuck with that one single line of poem she composed as a young girl. Her bold dismissal of the men around her and her martial spirit when facing deadly threats, on the other hand, were rarely mentioned in later writings. As the authors of Red Brush comment, Xie Daoyun became for women of later dynasties, especially those of the Ming and the Qing, the model par excellence of a woman poet. She combined in one person all the elements that in later times would define the ideal woman poet. An exceptional talent shown at a very early age and immediately recognized by an elderly male authority figure, a life of dedication to her husband's family, and a chaste widowhood. Yet, just like Ban Zhao, there's much more to Xie Daoyun than her chaste behaviors or her poetic genius as a young girl. As always, the cultural memory about her has been selected according to later interests and essentially male perspectives. In this context, it's particularly meaningful for us to recall the impressive boldness and strong personality of this woman poet, who came to be remembered for the frail image of the Willow Floss. On this note, let's conclude this lecture. Please complete the quiz below this video and watch the next video on Buddhism, Taoism, the genre of strange writings in relation to women's writings.